Fellow Sadza eaters, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, vasnamalites, varikudya rice, nevasnama rights. Welcome to the special report. What happens in South Africa affects Zimbabwe, and what happens in Zimbabwe also affects South Africa, positively and negatively. But it's very clear that Zimbabwe can't do without South Africa, both politically and economically. You see, these two countries don't just share a border, they share a history. Whether you are talking about the founder of the Ndebele nation in Zimbabwe, Mzilikazi, who before migrating to Zimbabwe was actually a regimental commander in Shaka Zulu's army. Whether you are talking about the role played by Prime Minister John Vorster of apartheid South Africa in convincing Ian Smith to talk to the nationalist leaders in what became known as the Dayton period in 1974, which facilitated the release of nationalist leaders like Robert Mugabe, Joshua Nkomo, Ndabaningi Stole, and many others who had spent 10 years in Rhodesian prisons. South Africa and Zimbabwe share a whole history. Whether you are talking about the armed struggle in which the ANC's military wing fought alongside ZIPRA on many battles, including the Battle of Wankie in 1967, in which ZAPU and ANC guerrillas engaged the Rhodesian forces for several days. Even during the Gukurahundi period in the early 80s, many ZIPRA commanders left the Zimbabwe National Army and joined the ANC. And if you want to know more about this, please do watch the Gukurahundi series, which I'm currently running on this channel. It's a comprehensive truth-telling exercise. This Gukurahundi series is not about propping up ZAPU or denigrating and castigating ZANU-PF. It's just a truth-telling exercise, setting the record straight, telling the Zimbabwean history the way it should be told. We are currently on part 2, so watch out for part 3. Anyway, back to the topic. South Africa and Zimbabwe are more than just neighbors, and South Africa is the dominant partner, has played a pivotal role in the political affairs of Zimbabwe, most notably the Global Political Agreement of 2008, which was brokered by SADC and mediated by President Thabo Mbeki. From an economic standpoint, Zimbabwe is the supermarket of South Africa. Mzansi is Zimbabwe's biggest trading partner by far. But South Africa also benefits from the Zimbabwean cheap labor. Many degreed Zimbabweans are working in South African restaurants, earning peanuts. Many are surviving on tips from customers. South African businesses prefer hiring foreign nationals because of cheap labor. This sometimes leads to xenophobic attacks from South African nationals who feel foreigners are taking all the jobs. So, Tafi, why are you telling us all this? Well, I said all this to make you understand why South African political issues are relevant to Zimbabwe. So, when you see us as Zimbabwean content creators talking about South African politics, don't look away. South African issues affect Zimbabwe, so they are relevant in our political discourse. So, this is why I'm going to react to this video of Julius Malema, leader of the third largest opposition party in South Africa, the EFF. And as you all know, South Africa will be going to the polls on the 29th of May. This is a big deal for Zimbabwe. The political and economic stability of South Africa is very key to the political and economic stability of Zimbabwe. If the opposition was to win in South Africa, that would be disastrous for ZANU-PF, because almost all the opposition parties in South Africa are opposed to the ZANU-PF rule. A win by the opposition in South Africa will mean that, for the first time since independence, Zimbabwe will share its border with two countries that have governments led by political parties that don't have a soft spot for ZANU-PF. And from a geopolitical standpoint, the mega influence of a South African government run by one of the current opposition parties in South Africa would be disastrous for Mbiyaneanda's party. But of course, I don't see any opposition party right now in South Africa winning an outright majority in the upcoming election, But the ANC itself may fail to get an outright majority, and that will mean a coalition government, which might not even include the ANC, depending on how well the opposition parties do when you combine their total vote is against the ANC in terms of outright majority to form government. And in case you didn't know, South African presidents are not directly elected by the people. So when South Africans go to vote, they are not voting for a president. What actually happens is that people vote for MPs. Those MPs are the ones who will then choose a president once they get into parliament. So that means South African presidents are elected by parliament. The process is presided over by the Chief Justice. It's the same system Zimbabwe used to have from 1980 to 1987, where the president and the prime minister were not directly elected by the people. But South Africans chose not to have a prime minister. They have a president who performs both Mugabe and Banana's roles combined. So once again, as South Africans are going to vote in this election, they are not directly electing Ramaphosa or Malema or Steenhuisen. They are voting for MPs who will, in turn, choose a president. This process is very simple and straightforward when you have a party that has an outright majority in parliament. However, once you have a hung parliament, like what happened in Britain in 2010 when David Cameron and Nick Clegg formed a coalition, anything can happen. This is by far the most eventful and watershed South African election since 1994. So, we all know that Jacob Zuma is back in mainstream politics with the MK Party, Umkhonto weSizwe, which was the name of the military wing of the ANC during the liberation struggle. It's almost like if Robert Mugabe had decided to run in the 2018 elections under a new party called ZANLA. As we all know, ZANLA was the military wing of ZANU. So you can imagine the amount of backlash, resentment, resistance, and threats Robert Mugabe would have received from ZANU-PF. I mean, if ZANU-PF could stop a simple Kasukuwere from running as an independent candidate, what more would they do to the legendary Robert Mugabe for using the equally legendary ZANLA name? There is no telling what ZANU-PF would do to Mugabe for doing a Zuma on them. But of course, South Africa is different from Zimbabwe. The MK Party was allowed to run, and Zuma himself has also been cleared to run despite fierce resistance from the ruling ANC party. This shows you that there is a clear separation of powers within the South African arms of government. The South African courts and the Electoral Commission are independent. But Malema is not happy that Zuma chose to endorse the MK Party. Julius Malema wanted Jacob Zuma to do what Robert Mugabe did for Nelson Chamisa in 2018.
I spoke to the old man. He launched that thing on the 16th of December. We met on the 15th of December, if not the 14th, somewhere there. And he had actually suggested that there should be such an engagement to brief me about then his next political move. And I had a different view. And I said, look, we are here as the EFF, and we think we've got solid structures and good election machinery. We can actually, with your endorsement, make some inroads in difficult areas where we couldn't make inroads before. And that you do what President Mugabe did with Chamisa and says, I'll vote for this young man because I can't vote for people who tormented me. That was not to be, but we agreed that let's go and fight this battle. And we'll meet each other on the other side.
You wanted him to endorse you?
You wanted him to endorse the EFF.
Now, in case you don't know what Julius Malema is talking about, well, in 2018, on the eve of the election, Robert Mugabe endorsed Nelson Chamisa.
I said, I can't vote for those who have caused me to be in this condition. I have also said, my Mjuru and my coupe don't offer very much. So there is Chamisa left.
So now, this is exactly what Malema hoped Zuma would do for the EFF, but it wasn't to be. Zuma decided to endorse the MK party. Malema was asked about his thoughts on the IEC. The IEC is the ZEC of South Africa. So the question was, Mr. Malema, do you feel like the South African Electoral Commission is independent, professional, and competent? Are you confident that it's going to run the next election properly? The following was Julius Malema's answer.
Our IEC is one institution that is credible and has been running elections for some time now, and in a very diligent manner. There's nothing called perfect. There will always be those rogue elements, which the IEC, when exposed, it doesn't hesitate to act.
There is nothing called perfect. There will always be those rogue elements, which when exposed, the IEC doesn't hesitate to act on. These are the words of Julius Malema. When the conduct of an electoral commission is given a 5-star rating by one of the main opposition parties, then you know that there is a functional democracy in that country. In Zimbabwe, the electoral commission plays hide and seek with the opposition. It is blatantly biased in favor of the ruling party, even when it comes to the design of the actual ballot paper itself. They always design it so that Mnangagwa's name is always on top. There is gerrymandering of electoral boundaries in the delimitation process. Voter registration is a nightmare in urban areas. They make people stand in queues all day in an effort to frustrate the urbanites and discourage them from becoming registered voters. But of course, elections don't always go smoothly in each and every country that you can think of, America and South Africa included. But however, what happens in Zimbabwe during election time is extraterrestrial. Julius Malema continues with this 5-star rating of the Electoral Commission of South Africa.
What we are busy with now is to always make sure we oil the election machinery of the EFF. This is how this thing is so transparent of elections. Counting happens at the voting station where you voted. After counting, the result slip must be put outside the door of a counting station. Your party agent must go and take that result slip, a picture, and send to the EFF National Operations Center. The EFF then takes that into their own system. Then you get your actuaries to come and consolidate those things. They know how. Those are the best brains. They consolidate your numbers. Then they take the results of the IEC, they match them. What you have in the EFF must speak to what the IEC has. And if there is a discrepancy, the actuaries then say there is a discrepancy of 300,000 votes, and then the discrepancy is in the following voting stations. This voting station said EFF 200, but the IEC on the same voting station says 20. So they just removed 0. Then you've got scientific evidence, which you can go to electoral court and have the results overturned. And it doesn't mean burning down of IEC offices, even when we find evidence of wrongdoing. It means we now go to a neutral court, because our judiciary is very, very independent.
So there you have it. The South African electoral system is transparent and the judiciary is independent, fair and just. So whenever there are issues, you know that there is a recourse. That clear separation of powers within the South African government is what makes their democracy work. But you know, it's not as if the Zimbabwean constitution doesn't provide for a clear separation of powers in arms of government. Section 131 of the Zimbabwean Constitution clearly lays out the separation of powers, and I've explained this fully in my video titled The Politics of Succession in Zimbabwe. It's available on this channel in case you haven't watched it. The point I was making is that The biggest problem in Zimbabwe is not the law. The biggest problem is compliance. The South African electoral process, as explained by Malema, is not too different from the Zimbabwean electoral process. The process is almost similar. The difference between the South African electoral process and the Zimbabwean one is that the South African institutions respect the law and they are compliant. However, the opposite is true in Zimbabwe. Our biggest problem in Zimbabwe is not electoral reforms. Our biggest problem is how to get ZANU-PF to comply with the law. What's the point of making new democratic laws when ZANU-PF does not respect the existing ones? They only follow the law when it suits them. We all know that. It's not even a matter of debate. You tell me now, why is Malaba still the Chief Justice? Why does ZANU-PF abuse the ZBC when the constitution is very clear? The national broadcaster should be impartial. Why was Pastor Messiah killed for supporting the CCC? Why was Mboneni Ncube killed at the CCC rally? Why was Mazibabawe Shanduko tortured? Why are chiefs and village headmen used by government to canvass support for ZANU-PF? What does the constitution say about demagoguery, violence, intimidation, trepidation? The whole system is built to keep ZANU-PF in power. I mean, you tell me, why is it the Electoral Commission refuses to release the voters' roll on tying for inspection by the opposition? This reminds me of the words of Paul Mangwana. He said the following, and here I'm paraphrasing. He goes, ZANU-PF controls the entire system, including its institutions, agents, and guns. And what do you as the opposition have? The law? Do you honestly think that the law can stop guns? These are the words of Paul Mangwana. Of course, I paraphrased them. Once again, I reiterate, our biggest problem in Zimbabwe is not the law. Our biggest problem is how to make ZANU-PF compliant. Before we worry about electoral reforms, let's first worry about the observance of the law by ZANU-PF. But the problem is, the Zimbabwean crisis is multifaceted. On one side, you have a government which is above the law, and then you have the citizens who are apathetic to political issues. But if the citizens are apathetic, then the opposition leaders are downright pathetic. I mean, the CCC is only 2 years old and already it has 3 factions. One faction led by Walshman Ncube, another led by Jameson Timber, and then another one led by Dingilizwe Chuma. And the MDC? Well, the MDC is more ruined than the Kami ruins. For what it's worth, every time I get emotional about the state of the opposition in Zimbabwe, I am comforted by the words of the late great father Zimbabwe. He said, Zimbabwe will not die. Its young people will save it. Blessed be that day when the young people in Zimbabwe shall have a generational consensus, united in their resolve to correct the wrongs of the past and chart a new trajectory of oneness, of Ubuntu, of peace and development, political, social, and economic transformation, recognizing that you are Zimbabwean first before political affiliation. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.